Now, after term 2, year 1, how do Americans view it? Look at that. A failure. Fail, fail, fail. 58%, just 42% say a success.
This screen is not showing just numbers, it is showing how public thinking changes over time. One single leader, 2 different moments in time, and 2 completely different judgments. To understand these numbers, the first thing we must accept is this. Public opinion never changes suddenly. It is never the immediate result of one statement, one incident, or one decision. Public opinion is built slowly, through everyday experiences, expectations, and through the comparison between promises and what people actually see on the ground. That is why the numbers on this screen tell a story. But the roots of that story are hidden inside time itself. The figure on the left represents April 2024. It captures a moment when people were looking back and summing up their recent experiences. At that time, a majority believed that things had moved in the right direction overall. 55% described the experience as positive, while 44% viewed it as negative. This was not an overwhelming mandate, but it clearly showed that dissatisfaction had not yet taken full control. People were still balanced. They were thinking. They were comparing. There is an important point to understand here. This 2024 evaluation came when people had the benefit of complete hindsight. Both the good and the bad were visible. People were looking back, and in such moments, perceptions often soften. Time gives context to decisions. Time dulls some questions. That is why public judgment during that period was not entirely harsh. But time moves forward, and with time, expectations change. When the same leadership continues, the public does not only judge the past, it begins to attach hopes to the future. And this is where the second part of the story begins. When we now look at the current numbers, the picture changes. This is not a retrospective evaluation. This is a judgment of the present. The leadership is the same, but the environment is different. Here, 58% believe that things have moved toward failure, while only 42% still see things positively. This difference is not just numerical. It reflects an emotional and psychological shift. This shift matters because it has appeared in real time. When things are still unfolding, public patience becomes thinner. Comparisons become sharper. Questions become more direct. People no longer ask, what is the direction? They ask, where is the impact? And this pressure is the hardest test for any leadership. In 2024, the public was still thinking. In the present moment, the public appears to be moving toward conclusions. That is the most important signal of this graph. This is not merely a story of declining support. It is the story of a moment when hesitation begins to fade. When people stop standing in the middle and start leaning to one side. In politics, this turn is critical. Support can fall and rise again. But a shift in perception is deeper. When people begin to feel that their priorities and the priorities of those in power are drifting apart, a distance of trust begins to grow. This change is never driven by one issue alone. It is tied to daily life, inflation, stability, future security, and the feeling of whether those in power truly understand ordinary concerns. When that feeling weakens, the impact appears in the numbers. That is why this screen should not be viewed only politically. It is also a reflection of social psychology. It shows how people connect experiences and arrive at conclusions, and once conclusions begin to form, they do not remain limited to opinion polls. It is also important to say this clearly. This is not a final verdict. Public opinion is never fixed. Circumstances change. Decisions change. Perspectives can shift again, but the direction indicated by this graph suggests that trust is no longer as effortless as it once was. Politics often says that time changes everything. Sometimes, time does not change. It reveals. This green is a part of that revealing truth. It shows how the same leadership is seen through 2 very different lenses at 2 different times. And this is where part 1 ends. Because every discussion, every comparison, and every analysis that follows stands on the foundation of this shift. When public thinking changes, its impact appears not only in numbers, but across the entire political atmosphere. When the public gives a leadership a second chance, it is not based only on past experience. It is given with future expectations. That is where the second phase begins. The first phase is comparison. The second phase is expectation. And the higher the expectations, the stricter the evaluation becomes. In a second opportunity, the public assumes that mistakes will be corrected, that unfinished work will be completed, that issues which cause dissatisfaction will finally see clarity. That is why patience decreases and questions increase. People no longer ask whether effort is being made. They ask whether results are visible. This is where the gap between hope and reality begins to surface. If the priorities people carry forward are not felt in everyday life, trust slowly weakens. This weakness does not appear suddenly, but over time it becomes unmistakable. That process is visible in the current data. In politics, this gap matters because it is not only about policy. It is about emotion. It is about whether people feel that those in power treat public concerns as their own. When people begin to sense that attention has shifted elsewhere, the level of dissatisfaction changes. Often, this change does not appear as open opposition, but as distance. People drift away before they become angry. They listen less. They trust less.
What brings me here today is I see what's going on in our country, and I'm just appalled by the administration.
That is why perception shifts before support declines. And once perception changes, reversing it is never easy. It is also important to understand that the public does not change all at once. Some question early, some later. But when majority movement becomes visible in data, it means the shift is no longer marginal. It has entered the mainstream. In a second term, another pressure emerges. Comparison. People compare not only the present, but also past promises. They ask whether their own lives have changed with time. If daily life does not feel easier, even major decisions begin to feel distant. That is why, at this stage, numbers become social signals, not just political ones. They reflect how deeply people feel connected to leadership, and when that connection weakens, it appears in every assessment. It would be wrong to say that everything is decided at this point. No political situation is permanent, but such a turning point cannot be ignored. It is the moment when dialogue between leadership and public is tested. If this distance is understood, if priorities are reconnected, perception can soften again. But if it is dismissed as temporary dissatisfaction, the gap deepens further. This is the core of part 2. It does not tell us the ending. It tells us the road has become difficult. And in politics, difficult roads require more than power. They require understanding and sensitivity. From here, the next question emerges: is this change temporary, or does it point toward a deeper direction? The answer to that question will shape what comes next. When perception about leadership deepens, it is no longer just a reaction to current conditions. It becomes a combination of past comparisons, present experience, and future anxieties. This is the point where numbers begin to speak to history. Because in politics, major turns are not new, but their impact is always different. History shows that when a majority begins to form a similar view about leadership, that view does not reverse suddenly. It settles slowly. First come questions, then doubts deepen, then a stable conclusion begins to form. The current data points toward that stage where uncertainty starts to fade. There is an important distinction here. Dissatisfaction and disappointment are not the same. In dissatisfaction, hope still exists. In disappointment, hope begins to weaken. When people start believing that change is becoming unlikely, perception turns a distance. And in politics, distance matters, because support is not built only on policy, it is built on emotional connection. When that connection weakens, every decision is seen differently. Steps that once appeared decisive now fall under suspicion. History shows that in second chances, the public is harsher. The first chance is experimentation. The second is results. People expect no excuses. That is why conclusions formed in the second phase last longer. Current perception reflects that hardness. It is not only judging what was done, but what actually changed. And when change is not felt in daily life, even big promises start to feel hollow. This perception does not stay confined to opponents. When independent thinkers begin to share similar conclusions, the signal becomes stronger. It means the story is no longer just political debate. It has become lived experience. History also shows that at this stage, leadership has two choices: either recognize the distance and realign priorities with the public, or dismiss the change as temporary and move forward. The second path almost always widens the gap. Perception is never completely permanent, but the longer it lasts, the deeper its roots grow. Once perception becomes part of history, It cannot be changed by decisions alone. It requires trust. That is why this phase is not just present analysis, it is a warning for the future. It tells how the story may unfold if direction does not change. In politics, warnings often arrive as numbers. This is where part 3 ends. Because the question is no longer whether perception has changed, the question is how deep that change has become. And that depth will decide what comes next. When perception begins to clash with policy and authority, its impact moves beyond opinion polls. It directly affects how decisions are seen, understood, and accepted. This is where politics becomes practical. At this point, every policy becomes a test. The question is no longer what the decision is, but who is making it and why. When trust weakens, even good intentions fall under doubt. That is why the same decisions produce different effects at different times. This becomes even clearer during elections, when people feel priorities no longer align. Voting stops being only support. It becomes a message. People signal that their everyday concerns are not being heard. That feeling gradually becomes the center of political debate. At the policy level, leaders feel this shift. Falling trust brings either haste or hardness. Orders replace dialogue. Force replaces clarity. But this often increases distance rather than reducing it. There is an old political truth: when communication weakens, every step feels mistimed. Current perception reminds us of this truth. People do not only want results, they want to see their priorities reflected in decisions. Here, electoral strategy changes. Instead of strengthening support, efforts turn toward limiting losses. Language hardens. Messages become defensive. As this continues, political tone changes. Independent voters become crucial. Because they are not tied to ideology, their movement shows how widespread perception has become. When this group begins to feel distance, it becomes a social signal, not just an electoral one. This conflict between policy and perception cannot be solved by one decision. It requires consistency, dialogue, and acceptance that priorities have drifted. Without that acceptance, change remains incomplete. This is why this phase is the most challenging. Here, direction alone is not enough. Trust must be rebuilt, and trust grows from experience, not announcements. Now, the question is not whether perception has changed. The question is whether it can be reversed. This is the hardest moment in politics, because from here forward, decisions alone are not enough. Trust is required. And trust is built through lived reality, not authority. History shows that public opinion is never fully fixed, but the longer a perception lasts, the deeper it settles. Current signals suggest this is not temporary frustration, but a feeling strengthened over time. At this point, leadership's biggest challenge is not changing direction. It is restoring connection. People do not count decisions. They ask how life has changed. If that answer is unclear, even large reforms feel small. Changing perception requires behavior, not just words. Announcements attract attention. Trust returns only when daily life feels better. The road ahead is not simple. If alignment is rebuilt and dialogue restored, perception may soften. If distance is covered with noise, it becomes more visible. Politics often says time gives second chances. But second chances are always harder. Expectations are higher. Comparisons stricter. That is why decisions at this stage shape years to come. This story does not end here. Public opinion does not deliver final verdicts. It delivers warnings, signals of what people feel, want, and expect. The ears who read these signals have a chance to change course. Those who ignore them face a harder future. This is the conclusion of the entire series. It is not about one number, one graph, or one moment. It is the story of the relationship between power and the public. And when distance grows in that relationship, politics faces its most important question. Can trust be rebuilt? This is where the analysis pauses. The decision belongs to the people. Time will decide direction. But the signals visible today tell us one thing clearly. In politics, the biggest changes often arrive not with noise, but with silence.